Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a special and hopefully engaging conversation about how traditional wisdoms and faiths guide social impact work. I am Rachel Littman, Yale College class of '91 and the executive director of the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance, otherwise known as YANA. So here at YANA, we explore and support not only what people do to improve individual lives and communities in the world, but why we do what we do, what compels or inspires us. And there are many ways to look at and answer that question. So today we're going to explore one of the lenses through which we can understand some of the commonalities of our existence that bring us to the work that we do, namely the grounding in traditional wisdoms and faiths. Now, our panelists this evening represent both the Judeo-Christian faiths as well as one who's experienced in those in traditional indigenous wisdoms. Now, I also have with me my colleague, Mick Hirsch, Yale Divinity School class of 2003, who's going to be co-moderating with me. Mick is the executive director of THRIVEGulu in Uganda, and he's also very familiar with the principles of Buddhism, so maybe Mick will be able to chime in some comments as well. He did a big job moderating one of our earlier panels this year on the surprise blessings that faith leaders embraced in their communities during the pandemic, and I'm delighted to welcome Mick back, who's going to be introducing our panels in just a second. Before I hand the mic over, I do want to remind everyone that this program is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube and Buzzsprout pages in video and audio versions respectively. So we'll send that link around. You can always go there to see our archived programs. We will also be monitoring the chat and the Q&A function, so please feel free to type anything in there. We will try to unmute people during the Q&A section so we can actually make this more of a conversation and as inclusive and engaging as possible. So without further ado, thank you all of our panelists, and Mick, I turn it over to you.
There we go. Thank you. Wonderful. I'd like to thank you, Rachel, and everyone at YANA for the invitation to co-moderate today's webinar. And I'd like to thank in advance each one of the panelists for being part of what most surely will be an interesting discussion on social impact by way of spirituality and wisdom traditions. I have agreed with the panelists that in lieu of lengthy introductions of these eminent personalities, that I would refer you to the biographies that accompanied the advertisement for this webinar, and instead allow each one to introduce a little bit about themselves by going straight away to a question on the important work they are doing in the world. So I think I'm going to start with Rabbi Brad Hirschfield, who, among many other things, is the president of the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership. So Rabbi Hirschfield, one thing that struck me upon reading through your biography is your prolific use of various forms of media and communication to deliver a message on wisdom-informed social impact. And that's a message that is decidedly interfaith and plural. At one time or another, you have used blogging, TV, radio, newspaper, public speaking, book writing, and more. So Rabbi Hirschfield, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how and why you use media and communication in such interesting ways to share your message with a wide and diverse audience that includes some within your Jewish faith tradition, but also many who are devotees of other traditions, as well as those who seek and those who doubt. And importantly, how do you move your diverse congregation of readers, viewers, and listeners to take that step from receiving your message to acting upon it?
Oh, wow. Well, it's good you asked these softball questions, Mick. And please call me Brad. So the first thing I can't go further without doing is when you talk about seeking and even doubting, and this is part of the method. For me, doubting is a form of seeking. The idea that doubt is the opposite of faith strikes me as utterly absurd. Doubt, for me, is a healthy part of faith, and I'll go further, is a necessary part of faith. And in fact, without doubt, most faiths I know, certainly my own, and in my own experience as a much younger man, turns quickly into an idolatry all its own. Now, that's connected to why I use media, because, and it's also why I tried for 10 years not to be a rabbi. And I understand from a heuristic perspective, what do you mean tried not to be something? It doesn't work that way, Brad. You can try and do something and you can fail to achieve it. You can try and you can achieve it, or just don't do it. But how do you try not to do something? In fact, I did try not to do it because for me, having been exposed to lots of ways of Jewing in the world, and yes, I did say it that way, and I would love for people to imagine using their traditions in the verb form, not just the noun or the adjectival sense. In lots of different ways, from ways that were very, very untraditional and ways that were very, very deeply traditional. And one of the through lines that made me not want to be a rabbi early on was that it seemed to me all these rabbis that I met, and I loved them, and they added so much to my life, but they were all in sales. And by that, what I mean is the metric of success was how many people did I get to be like me? And having been exposed to so many different teachers, many of whom would not want to sit in the same room with one another, each of whom contributed to my life. And that's just Jews, plenty of non-Jews too. I knew that I was in love with the tradition, not as a sales project, but as a service project. And when you believe, by the way, there are plenty of people more successful than me who are using media as a sales project. And their metric is, did I get them to think what I think and believe what I believe and pray like I pray? That's not me. The other door you can go through and have mass audiences is you let go of a metric that says, do they look like me at the end? As opposed to, am I using the tradition I most love and I feel most called to help people become more like the human beings they think they're most meant to be? Once you move into that modality, then actually a newspaper, a television set, or a radio station can be a far more effective and congenial pulpit than a classic pulpit. I go to a regular synagogue, I like it, it's all fine and it's all good. But in the end, since for me, the tradition I embrace calls me to be in service to others and to help them become the person they most feel called to be, it's kind of a no-brainer to be in media, because I'm not looking to convince them, I'm looking to give them tools that let them, again, achieve what they most want to achieve in the world.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that. That very thoughtful and I mean, it really was a response that just made me think from the get-go when you said doubting is a form of seeking. Very, very powerful. Thank you for that. And hopefully that's a powerful and important segue into my next panelist, which is Dr. W. Franklyn Richardson, who is also a long resume, but is the senior pastor of Grace Baptist Church. And he is the chairman of the board of trustees for his alma mater, which is Virginia Union University, which is where he's calling in from today. So Dr. Richardson, your calling is to the Christian ministry. And in that capacity, you serve as senior pastor of Grace Baptist Church in the city of Mount Vernon, New York. The beginning of the church's mission statement reads, quote, "Grace Baptist Church is a multicultural center grounded in the African American tradition and focused on empowerment." I think this says a lot about Grace Baptist's ministry to its congregants and to the world. Can you unpack a little for us how scripture, tradition, and service all function together in fulfillment of your mission?
Thank you, Mick and Rachel, for being here. And thank you, Brad, for those powerful words. Let me tell you, I'll start with the scripture, right? The empowering notion of and our church's mission is to be found in, for me and for our church, has been in the teachings of Jesus, the life of Jesus. And the scripture, I guess, that I would most be captured by is that in 4:19 of Luke, where the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, but he sent me to set the captives free. We found our ministry, and much of the Bible has been a way for African Americans to have self-worth and a pathway to fullness. So it's not just a religiousness, it's a kind of sociology. It's about equality. It's about bringing, helping people to find the capacity to rise above the difficulties of racism, of classism, of the things that diminish humanity. And so we see our, at least I see my ministry that way. I started out in Philadelphia, and I accepted a call to ministry, which is in our tradition, but I never caught on how to make that suit what I understood. And I happened to grow up under the influence of Martin Luther King and the social justice notion of the biblical text and of Jesus. And when I heard that, that clicked with me. And the social gospel has set the stage for my now 52 years of ministry, always having a sense that the difference the church ought to make and the difference that Christian faith ought to make is that it ought to be transformative in the society. And that has been the joy of my journey, to have a congregation who is not just a Sunday place to worship, but one who's involved in social justice, one who marches, one who feeds the hungry, one who, we're on television. We do all kinds of unorthodox things. We're the first Black church in New York to affirm women in ministry. And so it's been a kind of place, a laboratory where they're open to new experiences. And to say that is to say that I feel real grateful. So the scripture informs Christianity from my perspective. Now, one of the things I must own is that there are a whole lot of Jesuses I don't know. You know, there's some presentations of Jesus I don't know who they're talking about. I don't know that Jesus. That Jesus that affirms oppression, that affirms status quo, that Jesus that makes some people special over other people, that Jesus that preserves, confuses patriotism with Christianity, that Jesus who doesn't know anything about repentance and who feels empowered. I don't know that Jesus, but the Jesus I know is the one who calls all humanity to be their best self, their full self, and to strive to find their harmony with God. Now that's the Jesus I know, but I have to admit and acknowledge that there are multiple Jesuses out here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richardson. Indeed, there are many multiple versions of Jesus out there, but I dare say you and your congregation are involved in a truly transformative mission in the world that is inspiring. And I would encourage all of our listeners to check out your website and see the breadth of social action and social justice ministries that you're involved with. So thank you very much for your thoughts there. And finally, I turn to our third panelist, who is Peter Giblin, who is a co-founder of LeCiel Foundation, again, among many other things. So Peter, all the way at the bottom of the homepage of LeCiel Foundation's website, there was a sort of mission statement that I found to be truly fascinating. It reads, holding the vision of what needs to be for all life to thrive harmoniously on the planet, we connect our current reality, ancestral knowledge, and modern technology. Then if you move on to the next webpage, which addresses approach and impact, LeCiel underscores a sense of urgency for all humanity, which is reinforced by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is then followed by a call. It's time to act. Peter, can you try to pull all of that together and introduce your unique approach to social impact work by helping us understand how this fabric of the reality of imminent crisis, spirituality and ancestral wisdoms, and technological innovation leads to a global movement to act?
Sure, well, I'll certainly do my best. Thank you very much to you and Rachel for inviting me. And, you know, I feel quite humbled to be on a virtual stage with Brad and Franklyn, if I may call you that.
Yes.
I'm not sure how unique it is, you know. Every word that the previous panelists shared resonates deeply with me. I'm extremely lucky to have interacted with a lot of different traditions, indigenous traditions around the world. And it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that everyone's talking about and connecting with the same thing. And in any mystic tradition, when one looks at the world that we're surrounded by, or even our own discomfort, you start to ask questions around why. You try to get down to the root cause of what the issue is. And if we look in our current civilization, they would argue that the root cause of our environmental issues, our financial issues, economic abundance or lack of, environmental issues, social issues, they all have the same root cause. And that root cause is the separation between the material, the manifested world, and the sacred. And so the notion is, in order to optimize our world, those two things need to be reconnected. And therefore, one has to start as a root cause action. One has to start working, I'm not sure that's the right word, spending time and applying oneself to growing in consciousness. Another way of saying that is connecting to nature, whether that's our inner nature, our family, the trees, the sunsets, and to recognize that we're actually not individuals, which is not what our culture promotes. You know, individualism, competition, competing for scarce goods, winner takes all, I need to have a big of this, more of that. We're all the same, right? We are all one. The other distinction about all mystic traditions is the notion that we can only actually learn through direct experience, right? And this goes back to the point around idolatry. There is no dogma in mysticism or spirituality. That's just an interpretation that a human or a group of humans, often a man or a group of men, decide to spin something in order to create a situation that's advantageous to them. Or maybe they really believe it, but it tends to be a bastardization. That's all the different forms of Jesus. You know, Jesus was a guy, he had an awakening. He followed his heart, he had visions, he had dreams. He had the courage to follow those. And so I guess to sum up, it's about connecting to the divine within, recognizing that everything is divine, and therefore things can have the potential to become a little bit more peaceful and harmonious. Once you recognize that everyone else is you, then maybe you want to start treating people a little bit better. And that leads to a whole series of principles, and you know, we could go on. But I think there's an opening gambit. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, the one thing that kind of jumped out at me is this idea that, you know, our connectedness is also asking that important question, why, together. That it's, you know, it's not just the individual asking why, which, you know, I think again is so much part of our culture. Is, you know, little children walking around saying, you know, why is that, why, and you know, that's kind of reinforced throughout our lives. But the idea of asking why as a collective, as one, is also very powerful, I think. Thank you for that. Now I'd like to turn it over back to Rachel, who will offer some questions.
All right, thanks, Mick, and thank you everyone for those thoughtful questions. It makes me think about not only how one thinks individually with relationship to the divine, whatever form that may be, but how we think of our relationships with each other, and whether that's the person sitting in front of us or a community. and the kind of the social justice work that everyone here, at least in our audience and all of you, are doing in various different ways. And this kind of curiosity and thinking led me over the summer to, I was inspired by some blogs and some other podcasts I'd listened to about, the complaint that maybe contracts are broken, the country's broken, the systems of climate change, everything's broken. And with the concept in our country, certainly, obviously based in a lot of faith, is this idea of a covenant or a mutual promise. And I don't know if you had time to read the article, the piece that I wrote and shared with, and I got some feedback from our audience, and hopefully if people are there that can chime in as well, that an interest in thinking about that. It made me think, and I think a lot of people are sort of trying to grapple with this way of understanding our relationship through the work that we do with others in our community. So I was just curious to know from each of you how your faith or tradition, what your thoughts might be about whether how and why we might think of ourselves in a covenant or a mutual promise with others or with improving the world, rather than contracts or some of the things that Peter was talking about, the sort of like I, me, get me what I want, and if it's not broken, don't fix it. If it's broken, we start over, we walk away from it. So that's a kind of a broad statement, but that's the basic idea, the role of and the thought of covenant in the work that you do. Brad, I saw you nodding your head first, so maybe I'll call you first, but let's just start writing.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and I read the piece, you know that I like it. So, in all transparency here, the first thing you talked about framing this in terms of brokenness, and I thought about a teaching by one of the great Hasidic masters who teaches there's nothing so whole as a broken heart. And I think the best understanding of that I can offer, because I'm not a big fan of breaking hearts or my heart being broken in all candor, is that I think what he might be saying is there's nothing so whole as a broken open heart. And there are plenty of parallels, certainly in Christian scripture, to the notion of a bleeding heart, and not as a way of mocking someone's openness, but appreciating that that is where we are most whole, is when our hearts break open to what is going on around us. Covenant in biblical tradition is the response to that kind of brokenness before the heart breaks open. And there's no covenant in the first chapters of Genesis. Covenant is the divine response after the flood. The whole thing has come so badly off the rails that we're told God has regret. That's its own interesting thing for a theology session, right? What does it mean to believe in a God who is capable of experiencing regret? Because usually we think regret requires that you need to, I didn't know it was going to happen. It's a very interesting teaching to present a God who seems not to know what's going to happen. And as a result, this God can go, whoops. By the way, that's a teaching unto itself. If you imagine a God who can go, whoops, probably we ought to have the bravery to do the same thing. But covenant is the system that God offers to Noah, and will then offer 10 generations later to Abraham, and renew in various forms of language in both Christian tradition and in Muslim tradition, and in others as well, but not as directly. So covenant is a response to when everything has gone wrong in ways that the contractual response are where we need redress. Whereas the covenant system is based on three very different things that I think are incredibly important at this moment where we are in the world. Covenant is inherently aspirational. Covenant promises beyond that which can be achieved. And in fact, if the covenant is not promising more than can immediately be achieved, the message is clear. Then get off your duff and go do it. The nature of covenant is to have the bravery and the faith, dare I say it. And frankly, I don't care faith in what if it motivates this. To be aspirational beyond what is reasonable. Covenant is conditional. It is unapologetically a deal in which the members say, you got to do this, and I'm going to do that, and we're going to hold each other accountable. So this is not some namby-pamby, airy-fairy, hug-it-out system. There are real demands and real obligations, and we will be hurt and angry if we do not fulfill them, because it really is conditional in that way. But here's the amazing thing. It is both conditional and it's also eternal. Yes, there are real conditions, and there will be real repercussions if we don't hold up our end of the deal. But at the end of the day, we're in it together forever. And that triangle of covenant that is inherently aspirational, that is unapologetically conditional, and it is, for all the sacred insanity of it, absolutely eternal, seems to offer a different way to move forward together. It doesn't make all the problems go away. In fact, it's a very clear-eyed statement that there are real struggles and real problems, and we won't all agree about what they are, and certainly not about how to solve them. But we'll never step away from is having a vision that is bigger than the immediate, real obligations that we make and demand, and a sense that whatever it is we're doing, we are in it together for far longer than we're going to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Richardson, I know you obviously are preaching all over the country and the world, and also engaging, as you said, the social justice issues, as you mentioned, in collaborating with the CDC for some of these vaccination campaigns, empowering people to improve their lives and to work for others. How does this sort of, do you ever think the concept of covenant come into that work from what your understanding?
Well, you know, one of the things is that being a Christian, I have an expectation that there is a conduct that I ought to respond. That there's a way I ought to live. And in the gospel in Luke, there's a whole notion that talks about how do you get to the kingdom? I'm paraphrasing. And the kingdom is the beloved community. How do we get there? And Mark lines up three things, and I flipped them. He says, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and soul, and to love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, I switched them. I put the first thing is to love yourself. People, that should not be taken for granted. And one of the great things we have to encourage people to do is to love themselves, no matter what the society, no matter what the conditions of active racism in your experience, you must love yourself. And so the first step for me to getting to this beloved community or the kingdom is that we love ourselves. The second becomes that I love my neighbor as I love myself. In other words, I have to affirm the value of my neighbor, the worth of my neighbor, in spite of his difference, in spite of his sexual orientation, in spite of her status. I've got to love based on the fact that I love myself. I want to love my neighbor. And the text goes on, talks about the neighbor, who the neighbor is in the global context. And then finally, I must love God. And the way for me to love God is to love my neighbor and to love myself.
Amen.
And what the text says is that if you get to the place where you can love yourself and love your neighbor, love your God, you are almost at the kingdom. You ain't in the kingdom, because there's still a bridge of grace that's necessary to get to the kingdom, because we'll never all earn our way into the beloved community. But when we've done all that we're supposed to do, ultimately, grace will give us the bridge to get to the kingdom. So that's the covenant response. You know, God's going to get you to the kingdom, but you're going to have to do this. You got to love yourself, love your neighbor, and love God. And then guess what I'm going to do for you? Like Brad said, I'm going to let you in the kingdom.
It takes work. I like that. Thank you, Dr. Richardson. Peter, I just want to pick up kind of where you left off of your comments about, understanding. It's obviously so similar thread between all these different faiths and traditions about the presence of some sort of divine. If you can recognize that in others, then it can help us move away from some of these individual thinkings, or not walk away if there's been some brokenness. So Peter, if you want to pick it up from your perspective. Yeah,
sure. I think, I'm wondering when we have a course at Yale on how to love oneself, love one neighbor, love one's neighbor, and love God, right? That's a useful course. That was beautifully said. I'm lucky enough to be connected to a tradition from West Africa in Gabon called Bwiti, which is a mystic tradition. Although there are, it's an evolving tradition. So there's probably 34 lineages within it, and there's strong ties to Christianity within some of them. Everything happens within community. So the village that I'm a part of there, Okala, which is run by Maître Atum Rubenga, the entire community, the whole village of maybe 120 people come together every Saturday night. Initiations happen there every week. And the point of an initiation is to a field, a container is created. Literally you get put into a room for a week. And the community, at least energetically, is supporting your connection to yourself. They'd say your higher self and to the divine. And then on the Saturday night, when you come out, the entire village is there to celebrate your reconnection. Everybody, they're all in costume. The costumes represent their higher selves, and everyone treats themselves, treats each other in the recognition of who their higher selves are. So you could see a 7-year-old boy during the week who's very quiet, very shy, but in ceremony and through the course of that evening, he might embody, a warrior, and he is treated as such by everybody with great respect, and he holds himself as such, and he is treated that way as well, during the course of the week. You only see the shift in ceremony. And at the end of this, dancing all night long, the celebration for maybe one new initiate, there is basically a 2-hour conversation where if anybody has an issue with each other within this community, it is voiced. People are very direct, very straight. The conversation is not necessarily that nuanced. This person did this, why did that happen? And the community comes together and solves, in inverted comma, get to a point of harmony between those people. So community is a really, really strong, important world. And the recognition that we are all in this together, whether it's a family or a small community or a PTA meeting, we all generally have the same goals and we're in it together. Just because that person's annoying me, well, you're both in the same village, you're both in the same family, and we've got the rest of the community to get us over the hump if we have some conflict. And the conflict may be around responsibility and accountability. You weren't on it. You weren't, doing your task as you're supposed to, but let's help you. We're not going to shame you for it. The other thing that comes to mind is the notion of, when it comes to covenant, is the notion of death and rebirth. It raises itself a lot. So the notion that a death represents the death of a series of behaviors, recognitions as you grow in consciousness and more awareness, that some things need to change. And then through ritual or meditation or prayer, or just paying attention, you start to change your behavior. You become a better member of the community. But again, that comes from a point of love. It's one of the biggest things, that the notion of loving oneself is deeply confused in our culture, and is absolutely fundamental. If you can't love yourself, you can't, not in a narcissistic way, which is another confusing thing in our civilization. Respect yourself, treat yourself properly, and don't get diverted by being so in service to others that you're neglecting yourself. That's another distraction. So it's fractal. It's oneself, it's one's community, nature itself. It's all the same. And then we just have many modalities to get to that place.
Thank you. I'd like each of your takes on that. So I hope the audience can take all this together and come up with their own sort of sense of what this idea of a covenant or a sort of everlasting togetherness promise looks like. So thank you for your responses. Mick, I'll hand it back to you for the next round of questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. That was a fascinating discussion on covenant. So thank you for bringing that up. I'm going to move now to a kind of a section where we'll talk about the influence of some other traditions on our own. And I know that we've already kind of talked how there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of things that we share, and that seems to be clear. But I think maybe in the way that we still interpret and experience and live out some of those values and commonalities is important here. So I'm going to begin with Brad. Brad, you are the author of a book titled "You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right: Finding Faith Without Fanaticism." And that title, to be sure, is befitting of any discussion on wisdom, reconciliation, and peace, I think. In fact, you are an expert, I would say, on how spiritualities can and do function, not only for good, but also for evil. But at the end of the day, you seem to always identify the goods and try to communicate and channel that goodness towards positive social change. Now, throughout your journey, can you name or discuss one goodness that you have learned from another faith or wisdom tradition that for you has informed or broadened your own tradition?
Sure, thank you. It's a great question, Mick. I want to be clear. I try and do what you described. I fail every day. And that's not false modesty. I think it's really incumbent upon us, the more we are in love with the particular tools and traditions we wield, the more self-aware and self-critical we have to be. Not apologetic, not flinching in our faith, but as boldly self-critical as we are anything else. Because the beauty of loving a tradition is that it does blind you to its warts, as it should. But once you know that it does that, then you go, okay, how do I build in correctives for the blindness? And one of them is by learning from others. And here I want to say something with the risk of, like, shattering some of the sweetness. I think there are really profound differences between our traditions, and I'm grateful for that. Theologically, I'm grateful for it because I believe that many of our traditions, if not all of them, different debate, not necessarily it's relevant, are the infinite gifts of an infinite God. But I'm finite. So there's no possible way that I can receive all of that infinite gift. Right? A very prosaic example is you can't pour 12 ounces of water into a 4-ounce cup. It won't fit. That doesn't mean the 4 ounces that make it into the cup I hold are not absolutely sacred. But the 8 ounces which God has spilled into the world, into other cups, are also sacred, and they're not mine. And the most elegant language I know for this, I take no credit for, belongs to Bishop Christer Stentel, of blessed memory, who was the Bishop of Stockholm for many years, and then went on to become, if one is allowed to invoke, a Harvard professor at a Yale event, became a professor of theology at Harvard Divinity School. Don't hate me, Mick, I apologize. And the phrase that he used was sacred envy, by which he meant that he could look at the domains of the sacred that were not his as a believing Christian and a proud Lutheran, and know two things. The territories unto which he looked were absolutely not only beautiful, but worthy of his envy. But he would never be there, because to be in those places would mean to not be in his place. And he was unapologetic about standing in his place, and equally unapologetic about the beauty that can be found, the truth that can be found in those other places, including truths that for me are not always commensurate with our own. In fact, the more truths that are incommensurate with my own that I can identify, the more certain, or at least comfortable, I am that I am in the domain of the infinite. Unless, of course, I think I'm infinite, in which case I need a different kind of doctor. But that's a separate issue. When we can identify the domain of the sacred that we cannot yet inhabit and may never inhabit, I think we're actually bearing witness to the infinite gift of an infinite God. The two that come to me, and if you asked me a different day, you'd probably get a different answer. And these two maybe not. From Christian tradition, the notion of incarnation. The idea, and by the way, it cannot be my belief, right? At the end of the day, I'm a Jew, I'm not a Christian. But the idea that God could so love the world, that God would become incarnate among us, which on the one hand I reject theologically, but is so incredibly beautiful. That kind of immanence, that kind of bold love, which makes no sense, that God becomes not God to be God, is beyond inspiring and moving. And you don't need to believe it to be moved by it. And the second idea and a notion of that kind of bold immanence, in which one leaves themselves to become themselves, which is my way of summarizing the mystery of incarnation, is from another part of the world, and I'm going to defer to you because it's a broad interpretation of essentially a Buddhist insight. And I don't know if the way to say it, this is where I'm deferring to you, is the idea that inactivity is not the same as passivity. Or if you want to reverse it, that passivity is not the same as inactivity. Or as one of America's leading Buddhist teachers, Sylvia Boorstein, used to teach, and wrote a book with this title, don't just do something, sit there. And the idea that for all of our wonderful aspirations to change the world, to march, to shake things up, to trouble the waters, to use any language we want, to bring the kingdom, I mean, I can use them from any tradition, to do tikkun olam, to use a Hebraism that's become very popular. I am moved by the fact that it takes a very different and equally sacred kind of strength and wisdom to not do something and just, in quotes, sit there. And that there is a profound insight to be found in that all the good acts in the world, they won't do. How do you get the mix right and the balance? I leave that to greater minds than me. Happily, you just asked what inspires me from other traditions, not how I combine them all effectively.
Thank you, Brad. So much in there from the infinite gifts of an infinite God. I love that. Very, very powerful, and I could reflect on that for many lifetime. As I can, this idea of inactivity is not the same as passivity. Really, my Buddhist connection is my beautiful wife, who is a Cambodian Buddhist, and I would have to defer all things Buddhist to her. She has tried to explain this concept to me 1,000 times and will continue to explain it 1,000 times more before I ask her to explain it another 1,000 times. So I can't do much with it, but I think we can just continue to hold it and allow it to be the powerful and beautiful idea and thought that it is. I'll move now to Dr. Richardson, to Franklyn. Now, Franklyn, you and I share something very special. When I went to the Yale Divinity School, as you had, I entered as an ordinand in the United Methodist Church. Now, we Methodists, and you probably know this, we talked a lot about what we call faith and good works, underscoring the imperative of that conjunction and. So faith and good works. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about Scripture, if you could first talk about your understanding of this important teaching from the letter of James and how, if at all, it informs your commitment to social action. But also, if you can identify a principle or practice from another spiritual or wisdom tradition that has contributed to a deeper embrace of the Christian call to faith and good works.
Well, I certainly am identify and affirm that passage in James, faith without works is dead, which is really a real strong connection to the Buddhist notion that Brad just brought up To do nothing is not to be passive. So, but the text suggests that if you don't have faith, the evidence of faith is works. In other words, that you have something to show, something that you can communicate, that and something that sets up an expectation in you. If faith without works is dead, I don't want to be dead. I want to be alive and representative of a living reality. Therefore, I must perform. I have to make a contribution to the. I have to make. David Dinkins used to have a saying that said that service is the space we occupy. The space is the price we pay for the space we occupy. In other words, if you say that you have faith, then you ought to be willing to have some demonstration. And I guess that's where I think that's driven me. I mean, I don't want to be at the end of the day with empty hands and no offering. I know whatever my offering is going to be inadequate, but I don't want to say that I lived my whole life and never gave anything back for living and never made a contribution to make the world better. Not that I could make the world better, but I could certainly participate in the possibility and in the promise of the world. So yes, faith is that. The other thing that struck me when Brad was talking, he was talking about that. I'm so caught by that cup of water, the water that the 12 ounces, 8 went over the ground. It was like in 1979, I heard Gardner Taylor give the Beecher lectures at Yale. And one of the things he said that has stuck with me across the years is, and this goes into this whole idea of seeing other faiths. He says, I don't know about all the windows by which men and women see God, that there are multiple windows by which we see God. There's the Buddhist window, there's the Hindu window. And he says, I am a Christian and I choose to see God through the window of Christ. But I do not eliminate the possibility because I know that my glimpse of God through my window is inadequate to capture all God there is. So I do not eliminate others. I acknowledge that there are other windows by which people see God, but I have found the window that I found to be adequate. It's been enough for me to live my life and to deal with my challenges and my situations, but I don't have any need to eliminate or diminish the multiple windows by which human beings see God. And that has been informative to me, and it's been comforting, and it's been, in some places in my tradition, it's been blasphemous because generally Christianity is only Jesus. Now, I've never been an only Jesus person. I believe in Jesus, but I believe there are other windows by which people can come to know God. And I have seen good works from people who look in other windows and don't look in my window. I've seen people show love who know nothing about my window, which causes me to believe that there is value in their window. And at some place in the ultimate close down of the creation, there'll be an indication where we all gather in the Okamuni and we'll discover that we're all in one room, and there's one God, and we just had different views of looking at God, and we just had different windows by which we perceive God. Now, that's, like I said, if I wasn't a 51-year pastor and former general secretary of the convention, National Baptist Convention, I don't think I'd be as free to say what I just said. Because there might be consequences, but now I'm totally free. And I own the fact that there are other windows by which people come to know God. I have no desire, and certainly it's true about denominations, it's true about other faiths. And so when you ask me for an example, one of the things that I've always found a connection to the whole idea of the Ark of the Covenant as being the symbol of the whole experience of liberation and the partnership and companionship of God with the Hebrew people as they make their way over their journey. That symbolizes my connection with Jesus. That Jesus is my companion, as the Ark of the Covenant is the companion. The evidence that God is with us, that God does provide, that God is in our circumstance. So that'd be my offering to your question.
Thank you, Franklyn. I think we're all very glad that we have heard you speak truth to some of these things that for too long and in too many unfortunate ways have been silenced. So thank you for giving voice to that. I think that's part of what makes our common bond is here as Yaleys so special, because we do often speak those difficult things. And your image of the window, and I would maybe even say, you know, not just looking out the window, but opening the window and letting the other person come in, which is also so important. So thank you very much, Franklyn. And then finally, I'll turn to Peter. So Peter, throughout LeCiel, there is a powerful sense of interwovenness of peoples. You've kind of already talked about this, but as you mentioned from your example from West Africa, from Gabon, your approach is fundamentally global, and that seems to transcend differences, boundaries, beliefs. The 12 elders, which is something that is showcased on the LeCiel website, to which I would direct people, and also the film, which is called The 12. All of this illuminates the beautiful harmony that I think LeCiel is illuminating. Collectively, it seems to me that this constellation of spiritualities, this plurality, is indeed, as we've kind of already said, a single spirituality, though, and that it's its own ancestral tradition and its own oneness. Can you talk a little bit about how the different, even more about how the different traditions within and without LeCiel how they contribute to inclusiveness?
I shall do my best. Thanks for the question. I mean, the vision I was getting while Franklyn was speaking is we've been blessed at LeCiel with, I mean, we were given a task. Basically, one of the 9 co-founders had a series of dreams and visions around 6 indigenous elders, 12 indigenous elders, 6 women and 6 men, coming together around a table at the United Nations in New York on a certain day, and that they needed to come together to do something. And because we're all initiates, we're all Bwiti initiates, and dreams is part of that culture, and as a way to access certain information, 7 of us quit our jobs and spent a year following the breadcrumbs to those 12 elders. So almost necessarily, rather than by choice, although it's a blessing, we found ourselves walking around. You could view a rotunda with, at least 15 different windows. And we got the opportunity to look through each of those windows. And what we saw inside was the same thing. Slightly more literally, we found ourselves on a different trip, some of us, in southern Venezuela with a tribe which involved a plant medicine I'd not come across before. And within that ceremony, spoiler alert, but not many of you may be going to Venezuela soon, something happens where you actually see 64 different windows, sacred windows. And it's impossible through that kind of direct experience to not understand or connect with the sorts of things that Brad and Franklyn have been speaking about. There are many windows, and it's the same thing. And so, of course, Franklyn, that goes to support one's faith. And when we're talking around evidence, my life became a lot easier through these direct experiences, which can also be synchronicities, right? Going, okay, this is real. All this immaterial stuff is not ideology. It's not even religion. It's the same thing, and it's real, and we can interact and we can learn from it. And it seems to be pointing us all towards the same direction,
Yep.
which is we need to collaborate. We can't do anything on our own at all. The whole point is that, you know, the earth is one playing field, and we're all on it, and we're all players. So let's kind of figure out a way that we can have more fun and play a better game. So I've had that privilege. I mean, being introduced to the notion of reincarnation through a lineage of Tibetan Buddhism called Dzogchen that I'm very close to is a whole other can of worms. In Bwiti and many of the traditions I've come across, reincarnation is a given. I spent times with the pygmies in one group of pygmies in Gabon, and their belief is the 60 people in their tribe have been reincarnating as sons and daughters of the same members of the tribe. So when a baby is born, they know exactly who he or she is, right? They're just going over and over again, doing their thing in the next lifetime. But they can remember the context of the previous lifetimes, which have an impact on how they go about their business and their community in this lifetime, which is an extraordinary idea. I mean, mind-blowing, right? So I've been lucky enough, and the other guys in LeCiel in regularly being bathed in a sense of awe and wonder at the diversity of everything that is the same.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter. That just truly fascinating, and I would love to just be able to replicate your experiences in traveling through all the world and meeting such really inspiring individuals. So, thank you. I will turn everything back to Rachel.
Okay, thank you all. This is I hate to jump around in some of this because we could say on any one of these topics. I thought I might do something a little bit different, a little more interactive with all of you in the audience. I'm going to launch a poll because I was curious to know. Hopefully, if something pop up, but just, and this is not inclusive of everything because there weren't many choices. My husband and I sat down. We were trying to come up with every single denomination of all different kinds of religions, and then I ran out. You can't ask that many questions on Zoom. So this is both just kind of curious to know who in our audience, people, where they are from. And I see there was a question about Islam, and yes, I would love to have that. This just happened to be the panelists we happened to get this time. I do hope some of my friends from the Texas Muslim Women's Foundation, women there up in the Dallas area, can chime in on some of these. And we will start opening this up because we'd love to hear some other responses if people have them. I don't know if anyone else can see this. We've got, about half of our audience is Christian. We've got 2 Buddhists, an atheist, a couple of from Judaism, Islam, and then a nun. This is a very condensed version of what the Pew Charitable Trust does, a lot better than we do. But I was just curious to see who it is in our audience. Interesting. Okay. Everybody's got a couple of seconds. All right, we'll just end the poll. And I'll share the results. So hopefully, I don't know if everybody can see that. It's probably pretty telling about, probably American audience. Anyway, I wanted to do something. I'm going to shout out to my colleague Buzz Morrow in DC, who just did this with us. It comes from a kind of a theater and a life stories telling project. If everyone, this is for the panelists right now, you've certainly shared a lot of things that influenced you in some of the larger texts. But if you could come up with this, be very quick, 3 to 5 influential, it could be a moment, it could be a text or a person that has guided or inspired you during your life. And audience, I'm going to ask everyone there too, because we're going to come back and want to hear what our panelists have to say. You can write it down or just think about it. And this is often a basis upon which we tell life stories. So it's top 3 things to your mind. And for those in the audience, please go ahead and type your answers in. I'd love to hear what people say. 3 to 5 memories, influential moments, texts, people, something that has guided or inspired to do the work that you do right now. I'm going to give everybody about a minute, and then we'll start with our panelists. Mick, you can do this too. And people in the audience, feel free to start typing in the chat if you come up with yours. . I'm seeing some beautiful ones. Beautiful. I'm loving the ones. Please keep them coming. Come them in. Anybody who's on the in the audience. All right. 10 more seconds. I love this. We're going to share all this and share it around. Okay, Dr. Richardson, share with us, and maybe a quick why.
Well, I think I was just going through my mind. So many people have blessed my journey. I mean, I'm a debt I owe. Martin Luther King Jr. though stands out because when I was coming into ministry, he set the tone of social justice as a part of what it meant to be a pastor, and he pushed the social gospel, and that helped me to shape my whole entire connection with the call that I had early in my life. So I credit him as being the most dominant spiritual impacting person on my journey.
Okay, excellent. Brad, you want to go?
Sure, very quickly. I can't claim that connection to Dr. King, but the connection there is that it was his funeral when I was probably 3 years old. It was the first time I remember seeing adults cry. And I didn't understand what was going on. I was probably, like I said, 3 years old. And all I knew was the first time in my life that I had seen grown-ups weep. And so it was very profound. My two most important teachers and my whole life, all the bad stuff is my fault. All the credit goes to my teachers. No joke. The first two important teachers, my mom and dad, neither of whom completed college degrees. And my mother was the one who embodied a kind of openness when I embraced traditional Judaism that was utterly foreign to her. And she said, we'll make it work. And in terms of adopting food laws, because she said, in your own home, you don't eat off of different dishes. My father came from a more traditional background, but had no problem buying what were otherwise forbidden foods, including foods he didn't eat, because there was nothing to debate. Some people did it, some people didn't. But what I remember is him making a little skull cap out of his hand wherever we went. Didn't matter. Could be pork on the table, could be kosher food on the table, and saying a blessing. Because my father understood that when you break bread with people you love, that's a sacred moment. And he taught me that. In terms of scriptures, very quickly, the Bible's first two questions have a lot to do with everything we've been talking about today. And they are both initially unanswered. God goes looking for the human beings after they've eaten the fruit of the tree and says, where are you? And that question is never answered for 20 generations. 20 generations later, God will call out to Abraham, and Abraham says, here I am. But it takes 20 generations. And by the way, the question is not who are you, but where are you? A question which cannot be answered without reference to other people and other places and other things. We are fundamentally relational. The second question, which is never answered at all, and I think purposefully so, is Cain kills his brother Abel. And the response is to God, what, am I my brother's keeper? And there is no answer to that, because I think we're meant to be re-answering that question every day of our lives. Every day of our lives, we are meant to be re-answering. But the first question, yeah, where are you? You better figure out where you are in the world. And that's Abraham and everyone since. The other one, am I my brother's keeper? That one, I don't believe is answered, because it is not meant to be answered finally and forever. It is meant to be answered an infinite number of times by an infinite number of people toward a vision, and only because Dr. Richardson mentioned it. What does it look like at the end? I'm a big fan of Isaiah 56. My house will be a house of prayer for all peoples, says the Lord. One house, lots of nations. It doesn't get resolved. What would a world look like? And we stood shoulder to shoulder, still identified as discrete nations, but able to be under one roof together. Not to resolve all the differences, but to hold them as part of something far larger than any one of us is by ourselves.
Beautiful. I love that. Really came up with that in 2 minutes?
I mean,
I did not share that question.
No, because I'm blessed. I get to do this for a living. Now, a lot of people would say, you call that a living? That's a separate issue. But in the meantime, I'm blessed. This is what I get to work on. So no, if I can't do that, you shouldn't have invited me. And by the way, I'm sure it wasn't as good as it needed to be, for which I apologize.
That was good. It was good. Thank you. Peter. Right,
sorry, just unmuting myself. So many things came to my mind, but my mother and father were a huge influence, specifically in that my mother's from Venezuela, my father's American, and from the age of 4, I grew up in England, and my parents were both were able to travel a lot, and were both very interested in other cultures and other people's points of view. You know, my father was a headhunter and opened a lot of offices in different countries, and I remember getting into discussions about, the stereotypes of different cultures and what it was like to get a French person and a German person and an English person in a room, and where you could expect the cultural conflicts. But that basically led to continuing their avid interest in different points of view and different cultures, and the joy I get from interacting with different ones. And I've been blessed to be able to have those opportunities. So that's a big influence for sure. My first spiritual teacher was Lama Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, who's of the Dzogchen lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. And one of the things that helped me go reasonably deep in that tradition was his reiteration of a lack of dogma. And that we all have to discover our own way. There's 9,000 different practices. Choose one, and if you enjoy it, do that. And when I asked him about investigating other lineages and practices, he was like, great, go for it. Come back and tell us what you learn, as opposed to, no, it's this way, you found the way, like, what are you doing going to investigate other stuff? So to have that blessing from someone who I held in such high esteem and continue to, was really liberating. So I would say those two were big ones for me.
Thank you. I see a lot of answers. People are quoting Martin Luther King comes up a lot, Jesus, and parents a lot too. That says a lot. Mick, do you have yours you'd like to share?
Sure. I'm going to say that the two that come to my mind are actually both communities as opposed to individual teachers. The first being the community that I currently work with and supposedly serve, although they certainly serve me insofar as they teach me amazing things, and that's the team and our group of what we call thrivers in northern Uganda, all of whom are survivors of a genocide, all of whom have a faith that is unshakable, and all of whom just have an embrace of life and world in ways that are just stunning. And my team in particular, they've all lived through these same things, and yet they are absolutely committed to helping their sisters and brothers to get through the challenges they continue to face. The second teacher would be my family in Cambodia, who in so many ways is utterly foreign to me. I don't speak their language. I can only understand them through the way that we live our lives in harmony together. And I've just learned more about myself and more about life and spirituality and just everything from them.
Thank you all for sharing. I know these are sort of, they're deep and they're personal, but if they come up, it's interested in kind of getting into the images on top of your mind when asked. So thank you for indulging in that little exercise. And thank you for those in the audience who shared. I'd like to call these together a little bit later. Mick, I don't know if you wanted to, if anything else you wanted to ask before I see there's a question from the audience, I'd be happy to read that. And I think this goes to each of the panelists. Is that all right, Mick, and everyone else?
Yeah, I'm fine. And Rachel, if you wanted to share too, not to put you on the spot.
Sorry, triumphant. I would say, I was definitely going to say my parents. That clearly what I was raised with, the need to give back, the privilege that one has in the world, and it's part of the calling. And I've only recently gone to try to find out what were some of the Jewish, texts and traditions that supported it. Like, where did that come from? So I've done some more reading about that to better understand that, but definitely came from my parents. Education has definitely just been a major thing that's influenced me in my life, and the ability to access it and to always want to learn more. And I'm just, maybe because I'm an athlete, the concept of movement, and I do feel a kind of certain responsibility to care for others physically if I need to, or if I'm with someone that I think that needs to be helped physically. That's something I kind of carry with me, and that was probably for my parents too, to be healthy, to care for oneself, and then be in a position where you can help others was certainly influenced me. I want to read a question from the audience that says, for each of you, what role does service and social struggle have in how you view the exercise of purifying one's heart? It's beautiful, i.e. drawing closer to truth, which seems to be a common goal of many religions and traditional wisdom. So, Dr. Richardson, do you have a response to that?
I think I'm not clear on what the question is.
Yeah, what role does service and social struggle have in how you view the exercise of coming closer to truth? Like, what is the role of struggle, I guess, with social and service, with the exercise of coming closer to truth?
Yeah, I think that there's an inherent struggle in trying to identify truth, and that's an evasive reality, and I guess that's where the function of faith comes. We trust our faith to define our truth, and then from there we struggle on how to live out that truth in our relationships with others. That for me is the struggle, that no matter what your faith is, it's the struggle you have to engage in, finding how can I serve? What's my response to the truth I found in my faith? There is something required of me. And if that's something required of me, it will certainly employ struggle to make it happen.
Brad, you're nodding. You want to go, and then Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I love that notion of the truth as an evasive thing. And I expect if someone who doesn't believe in something of ultimate value says it, I'm not so impressed. But it's precisely the person like Dr. Richardson who does believe in something of ultimate value and still has the bravery and the wisdom and the openness to then say to us, yes, but I understand the truth is evasive. Right? And I think that's what we need. People who are open-minded without a depth of commitment, that's easy. And people who are deeply committed without openness are, frankly, in my experience, dangerous. But if you can marry the willingness to give yourself over to something with the humility that says, yeah, I'm giving myself over to it, but I can't prove that that's the it. And the scripture that I think of with that brings us right to the growing edge of this, and frankly, truth be told, I think that's often abused by people who don't speak the way you've all spoken today, is Deuteronomy 16:18, justice, justice you shall pursue. And what I love about that scripture is, it's not justice, justice you shall do or you shall find. Pursue it. But know this, it's a moving target. And if you think you are fully in possession of it, I want to suggest that's the verse saying, then you ain't doing it. And at the same time, if you're not pursuing it, it can't be justice. So do we have the courage to not only pursue a notion of justice so intensely that we do it twice, justice, justice you shall pursue, and the genuine humility to accept that the justice we pursue is a moving target, and it will be understood sometimes in painfully diametrically opposed ways. And that that's actually a call to us to combine the passion to struggle for the justice we believe in and the humility to appreciate that we are never in full possession of that definition. And that not knowing it doesn't get us off the hook from pursuing it. And we dare not pursue it by playing the mind game with ourselves that, yes, we're pursuing it because we fully understand it.
Yeah. Peter, do you want to add some thoughts to this?
Wow.
I know.
Yes. For me, particularly in our culture, to go broader here sociologically, the lack of sense making and the ability to make sense and know what truth is on nearly any subject is just a complete mess, right? So anyone who can tell you what they know the truth is, maybe it's the start of a very interesting conversation, but it's difficult, and that goes to the point of humility. It's easier to start from a place of the recognition that we don't really know anything, and it's impossible to know everything. And also paradoxically, this notion of pursuing truth, and then at some point, and actually I think this happens, there are many milestones of, oh, I know the truth. And then at that moment, there's a separation between you and everyone else who you think doesn't know the truth. And now you've got to run around and tell people what the truth is. Which is a huge red herring. The other thing when it comes to perspective is I try and switch the word out, or it's maybe an interesting exercise to swap the word struggle for opportunity. If you approach life with the mindset of everything is an opportunity for me to grow and learn, then maybe there is a point to the current struggle we find ourselves in. And the struggle is not necessarily an overt conflict within myself or between me and others or the rest of the world, because that's also separation. It's a series of very challenging situations that allow us to try and see where the opportunity is, as hard as that is. And continue to learn and grow, at which point the struggle will probably, well, your perspective on it will change. And maybe the situation improves, particularly if we're doing it collectively.
It's beautiful thoughts, everyone. We're getting, we've been close to our end time. Welcome for any questions, or if there's anything else the panelists wanted to say that we didn't get a chance to discuss further. And Mick, otherwise I'll let you help, you can facilitate that. And I really appreciate everyone coming together. I know we can't possibly get every faith and tradition on here, and hopefully this is part of a growing conversation. I've just seen some very positive comments. So I think there are a lot of people in our audience for whom this really resonates, from no matter what your perspective in your faith and tradition. Mick?
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, kind of following up on that, I love to be a part of these things, and I would love to be in the audience and just listen and not have to worry about trying to come up with words to say anything. But I also, I would love to see this sort of thing become a series or something where we can kind of continue to rotate and pair up these wonderful voices and traditions to just learn from one another and see where this goes. To use Peter's idea of opportunity and Brad's idea of pursuing and the Franklyn's notion that we'll constantly be looking where it's grasping this evasive truth. So I love it, and I appreciate that we had people joining us and saying supportive things and wanting to join in the conversation. So let's continue it. But if anyone wants to say a closing remark or a word of wisdom, we are on the wisdom tradition here. So if anyone wants to add to that, please do.
I think we've covered a lot, but I don't want to put anybody on the spot. But
I mean, I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you both to Dr. Richardson and to Peter, and of course Mick, to you, and to you, Rachel. It is precious when anyone gets to find new teachers, and to have found 4 today is a gift. The way I don't want to squander that gift is to make sure that when this ends, I know what I'll do, and I would invite anyone else who wants to do it too, because I find it effective. Because our minds, my mind, most of us immediately go to the things we connected to most. Mm. I want to suggest, and for me, it's what I'm going to do, is what are the things that surprised me? Mm. Or even discomforted me a little bit? And then ask myself, without trying to resolve the difference, what can I learn from that which doesn't fit so readily into my categories and boxes? Mm. And for me to know that if people would take that approach out into the world of doing the big things that I am sure not just all 4 of you, but that everyone in some way in our audience does, I think we could actually begin to move toward that kind of engaged activism, which still cultivates the kind of surprise and curiosity that we need so badly.
Thank you. Good. Well, I'll wrap it up. I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone. I've learned a lot. I know there are many other voices I'd love to hear from as well. So I'm seeing a lot of support for doing a series on these, and I hope we can get each of you back. Mick, thank you as usual. You always have tremendous questions, and I'm glad our audience and our panelists really took those to heart and gave beautiful responses. So thank you for sharing your time with us, your wisdom, your thoughts, and for doing the work that you're doing. Please continue to learn and to teach us, and I hope we can have you all back at a point in the future to continue these discussions. So that's all I have. Mick, thank you again.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe.
And thank you to everyone for joining. That's much appreciated too. Hopefully we'll meet one day.
Thank you to our audience. Yes, absolutely. Have a great evening. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.